It is 11:15 p.m. on January 14, 1942, and the harbor of Santa Isabel lies still under a moonless sky. 3 vessels sit at anchor in the warm, dark water off the Spanish colony of Fernando Po, a speck of volcanic rock in the Gulf of Guinea that officially has nothing whatsoever to do with the war raging 1,000 miles to the north. Ashore, in a requisitioned house lit by borrowed gramophone music and rather more gin than anyone strictly needs, the officers of an Italian merchant liner and a German tugboat are being thoroughly, deliberately, expensively entertained. They do not know it yet, but this is the last night any of them will spend in command of their ships. Out on the black water, 2 elderly tugboats named Vulcan and Nuneaton are creeping towards the harbor mouth with their engines throttled to a whisper. Aboard them are 32 men who, by any reasonable legal definition, are about to become pirates. At precisely 11:30, the town generator clicks off for the night, exactly as it does every evening, and Santa Isabel is plunged into a darkness so complete that a man could not see his own boots. It is into this darkness that the tugs slip forward, engines cut, oars out, heading for 3 ships that Britain has no legal right whatsoever to touch. This is the story of Operation Postmaster, the night a handful of Special Operations executive agents and commandos sailed into a neutral harbor and simply took what they had come for. It was audacious to the point of recklessness, sanctioned at the very highest level of government against the advice of men who thought it madness, and it would end with 3 enemy vessels gliding out of Spanish waters without a shot fired, a chain cut, or a single body left behind to prove who had done it. Understanding how it happened, and why Britain was prepared to risk dragging a neutral nation into the war over 3 ships in a forgotten colonial port, means understanding just how desperate the Battle of the Atlantic had become by the winter of 1941 and how far a young and unproven secret organization was willing to go to prove it deserved to exist. There is something almost theatrical about the whole affair, and that is no accident. Every element of it, from the party ashore to the caps left deliberately on the quayside, from the borrowed tugs to the timed press releases sitting ready in a London filing cabinet long before anyone had cut an anchor cable, had been rehearsed and considered with the care of a stage production. Nothing about Fernando Po in January 1942 suggested it would become the setting for one of the most audacious small operations of the entire war. It was, by most accounts, a sleepy colonial outpost, its harbor a modest stopping point for ships plying the West African coast, its Spanish administration content to look the other way while both sides of the wider conflict quietly used its neutrality for their own ends. That very obscurity was precisely what made it useful, and precisely what made the operation possible at all. By the closing months of 1941, the war at sea had become a slow, grinding catastrophe for Britain. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant shipping faster than British and American yards could replace it, severing the supply lines that kept the country fed, fueled, and armed. Every ton of shipping lost was a ton of food, oil, or ammunition that would never arrive, and the Admiralty was acutely aware that the war could conceivably be lost not on a battlefield, but in the cold water of the mid-Atlantic. Intelligence reaching London suggested that German submarines operating off the West African coast were being resupplied covertly from within neutral colonial ports, refueling and rearming under the noses of officials who either looked away or actively assisted. Fernando Po, a Spanish possession whose governor was widely regarded as sympathetic to the Axis cause, appeared to be exactly such a location. Sitting in its harbor at Santa Isabel were 3 ships of particular concern: the Italian merchant liner Duchessa d'Aosta, some 8,500 tons, and the German vessels Licomba and Bibundi, a tug and a barge that intelligence officers suspected of playing a quiet role in keeping U-boats fed and fighting. The Duchessa d'Aosta was the real prize. She carried a powerful radio transmitter capable of reporting Allied convoy movements to anyone listening, and her cargo manifest was suspiciously incomplete, its first page missing entirely, fueling suspicion that beneath her declared load of wool, hides and copper ingots lay something considerably more useful to the German war effort. The trouble was that none of this constituted grounds for a conventional attack. Fernando Po was neutral Spanish territory, and international law was unambiguous. No belligerent power could conduct military operations there without provoking a diplomatic incident of the first order. Spain under Franco was formally neutral but widely believed to be leaning towards the Axis, and a botched British raid on Spanish soil risked handing Berlin exactly the pretext it needed to bring Madrid into the war on Germany's side. Conventional military options were therefore off the table entirely. Whatever was to be done about the ships in Santa Isabel Harbor would have to be done quietly, deniably, and by people whose existence the British government could plausibly disown if it all went wrong. Consider, too, the wider strategic arithmetic pressing on Whitehall that winter. Britain, in early 1942, was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, stretched thin across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and, from December 1941, the Far East as well, following Japan's entry into the war. Every resource was contested, every risk had to be weighed against a dozen competing demands, and the idea of committing scarce diplomatic and military capital to 3 ships moored off a colony most people in London could not have located on a map might reasonably have seemed indulgent. Yet, it was precisely this atmosphere of pressure that made the case for Postmaster compelling to those who understood the stakes. A U-boat resupplied covertly might sink half a dozen more merchant ships before its next visit to a proper dockyard, and each of those ships represented weeks of production, trained crews, and cargo that could never be replaced quickly enough. Against that backdrop, 3 vessels sitting quietly in a neutral harbor stopped looking like a marginal target and started looking like precisely the kind of problem secret warfare existed to solve. That impossible brief fell to the Special Operations Executive, an organization barely 18 months old, established in July 1940 under the Minister of Economic Warfare, Hugh Dalton, on the personal instruction of Winston Churchill to, in his memorable phrase, set Europe ablaze. In late 1941, the SOE had yet to prove itself capable of running a genuinely successful operation, and Postmaster would be its first real test on the ground rather than on paper. The men tasked with carrying it out belonged to the small-scale raiding force, a tiny unit of little more than 50 personnel under the command of Major Gustavus March Phillips, who had sailed from Britain in August 1941 aboard a converted Brixham fishing trawler named Maid Honor, ostensibly hunting for hidden German submarine bases along the West African coastline. They found none. What they did find, through the work of an SOE agent already embedded on the island, was a far more concrete target. That agent was Richard Lippett, who had quietly taken up a position with the shipping firm John Holt and Company, giving him a legitimate reason to be on Fernando Po and, crucially, access to information about the ships in the harbor. Lippett discovered that the crew of the Duchessa d'Aosta were a sociable lot, fond of parties both aboard and ashore, and he set about turning that sociability into a weapon. He organized a trial party some days before the raid, drawing officers off their ships to test whether such an event could be staged without suspicion. It worked. A second, larger party was then arranged for the evening of January 14th, timed to coincide precisely with the raid itself, ensuring that when the moment came, the ships would be defended by nothing more than a handful of bored watchmen. The technical solution to Britain's problem was, in the end, remarkably simple in concept and formidably difficult in execution. Send in a small, disciplined force to physically seize the vessels and tow them away before anyone realized what had happened. The Admiralty gave provisional approval on November 20th, 1941, only for the operation to be nearly strangled at birth. The local British military commander in West Africa, General Sir George Giffard, refused to release the 17 local men needed to crew the tugs, regarding the whole scheme as an act of piracy that risked far more than it could gain, and the Foreign Office and British Embassy in Madrid were similarly unenthusiastic. It took direct intervention from London, with final political approval granted on January 6, 1942, to get the operation moving again, and even then it came with one hard condition. Nothing recovered from the raid could be traceable back to Britain. The raiding party itself numbered 32. 4 SOE agents, 11 commandos from the small-scale raiding force, and 17 local recruits to crew the tugs, which had been provided, along with fuel and modest modifications, by the governor of Nigeria. 2 vessels were used, the larger Vulcan carrying March Phillips, his second-in-command Geoffrey Appleyard, and the fearsome young Anders Lassen among others, and the smaller Nuneaton under Captain Graham Hayes. Roughly the size of a modest coastal freighter herself, Vulcan was to close directly on the Duchessa d'Aosta, while collapsible canoes known as fullbots, quiet enough to approach a hull without so much as a splash, would carry Hayes's party towards the Likomba and Bibundi. The 2 tugs left Lagos on the morning of January 11, 1942, and spent the 3-day passage rehearsing what they were about to do, lowering the fullbots, practicing silent boarding drills, and coaxing engines that, in Nuneaton's case at least, were already beginning to show their age. Everything depended on darkness and on timing, and both, remarkably, fell into place. As the officers of the target ships drank and danced at Lippett's carefully arranged party, and as the town's generator switched off at 11:30 exactly as it did every night, the tugs closed the final 200 yards to the harbor entrance. Small charges, no louder than the crack of a car door slamming shut, were used to sever the anchor cables of the ships rather than attempting the slow, noisy business of winching them up by hand. Boarding parties swarmed aboard within minutes, overpowering the skeleton watch crews with barely a struggle, and tow lines were made fast before most of Santa Isabel had any idea its harbor had just lost 3 ships. In total, 29 prisoners were taken from the vessels, none of them harmed. Getting the ships away proved almost as tense as taking them. Once at sea, engine trouble plagued both the towing tugs and their prizes through the following 2 days, and the little flotilla struggled to maintain its rendezvous schedule. On January 16th, Vulcan reached the meeting point and was, in a carefully choreographed piece of theater, captured by the British corvette HMS Violet, providing precisely the cover story the operation needed. Nuneaton, her engines all but finished, managed to raise the Nigerian collier Ilorin by semaphore, which relayed word to Lagos, and a rescue tow was sent out to bring her and her prize safely home. Not a single British or Allied life was lost in the entire operation, an outcome that even its planners had not dared to fully expect. The chosen cover story, prepared in advance by SOE's propaganda specialists, claimed that dissatisfied German and Italian crews had mutinied over pay and conditions, sailed their ships into international waters of their own accord, and simply been found there by British forces going about their lawful business. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's a great deal more still to come about what happened once Spain and Germany began asking very pointed questions. Nobody in Berlin or Madrid believed the mutiny story for a moment, and the propaganda war that followed the raid was almost as remarkable as the raid itself. German radio insisted a British destroyer had forced its way into the harbor, depth-charged the anchor cables and shot the crews where they stood, an account so wildly inaccurate that the British Admiralty was able to issue a genuinely truthful denial without technically revealing anything at all. Spain's reaction was considerably angrier and considerably better informed. The Spanish Foreign Minister, Ramón Serrano Suñer, denounced the raid as an intolerable violation of Spanish sovereignty and hinted darkly that Spain might answer with arms. It is worth pausing on how close this came to disaster. There was no equivalent German operation of this kind to compare it against, because no other power was attempting quite this particular trick of legalized theft dressed up as an accident. The closest parallels lie not with Axis Special Forces, but with Britain's own later Allied partners. The American Office of Strategic Services, founded some 5 months after Postmaster in June 1942, would draw directly on SOE's methods and, in its formative years, on operations exactly like this one as proof that small, deniable raids could achieve strategic results conventional forces could not. German special units, such as the Brandenburg Division, specialized in sabotage and infiltration behind enemy lines, but nothing in their operational history matches the specific gamble taken at Fernando Po. A raid not on enemy territory, but on the territory of a neutral power, executed with the explicit expectation that its authors would lie about it afterwards and be believed, or at least not be provable. The material impact of Postmaster is, if anything, still debated among historians. Later analysis has suggested the U-boat resupply role of the Fernando Po ships may have been more limited than British intelligence feared at the time, and the captured vessels themselves, while useful additions to Allied shipping capacity in a period of desperate scarcity, were hardly decisive to the wider war. What is considerably less ambiguous is the psychological and institutional impact. For an organization less than 2 years old and still fighting for credibility within Whitehall, a flawless raid with 0 casualties, executed against the express wishes of the local military commander and approved personally against significant opposition, was an enormously effective proof of concept. One SOE officer in the region reflected afterwards, with characteristic understatement, that it might not in future be necessary to endure such prolonged negotiation before undertaking what amounted to a 30-minute operation. Hugh Dalton reported the outcome directly to Churchill, noting his belief that other neutral governments watching from the sidelines would draw the intended lesson, that Britain would, when it judged the stakes high enough, disregard the legal niceties of neutrality to get what it needed. Richard Lippett, the agent whose parties had made the whole scheme possible, paid the most immediate personal price. Brought in for questioning by Spanish authorities within days of the raid, he managed to talk his way out of direct suspicion, but found himself barred from leaving Fernando Po, eventually making his own escape from the island by canoe. Several of the raiders went on to considerably more storied careers. Anders Lassen, the young Dane aboard Vulcan that night, would later be awarded the Victoria Cross before his death in Italy in 1945, and the small-scale raiding force's proof that it could operate effectively helped shape the wider development of British Special Forces doctrine for the remainder of the war. The ships themselves lived on in more modest fashion, absorbed into Allied service out of Lagos, their cargo and machinery put to use in a theater of war that badly needed both. What endures about Operation Postmaster is not really the tonnage recovered or the intelligence denied to the enemy, useful as both were. It is the sheer nerve of the thing, a government weighing the very real risk of provoking a neutral Spain into war and deciding that 3 ships and a point about capability were worth that gamble. It is the image of a town generator switching off on schedule, exactly as it always did, while 32 men used that one small, mundane certainty to steal 3 ships out from under a sleeping harbor. It is the fact that no shot was fired, no life was lost, and no proof was ever left behind. Only a scattering of Free French caps dropped deliberately on the quayside to muddy the waters further, and a story about a drunken mutiny that nobody believed and nobody could disprove. Operation Postmaster earned its footnote in history precisely because it should not have worked. A tiny, unproven organization, working with borrowed tugs and a party thrown by a shipping clerk moonlighting as a spy, pulled off in half an hour what conventional military planners would have called impossible and diplomats would have called unthinkable. 3 ships sailed out of a neutral harbor that night and never sailed back. The men who took them slipped away into the dark exactly as they had arrived, leaving behind only rumor, outrage, and a story Spain and Germany could shout about but never quite prove. Return, for a moment, to that generator switching off at 11:30. It is easy, looking back across more than 80 years, to make Operation Postmaster sound inevitable, a clean, well-drilled success that unfolded exactly as planned. It was nothing of the sort. It survived a refusal of support from the very general responsible for the region. It survived the Foreign Office withdrawing its blessing not once but at multiple points in the planning. It survived failing engines, fraying tow ropes, and a rendezvous that depended on a semaphore signal reaching a passing collier by pure chance. It survived in the end, because a handful of men were prepared to gamble everything on a party, a blackout, and 30 minutes of near-silent, near-perfect execution in the dark. Had the generator failed to switch off that night? Had the party guests grown suspicious? Had a single watchman raised the alarm a moment too soon? The entire calculation Churchill and Dalton had made about Spanish neutrality, about SOE's credibility, about the delicate balance of a war fought as much through deniability as through firepower, could have collapsed in an instant. It did not collapse. Instead, 3 ships that had sat quietly serving, or at the very least suspected of serving, the Axis war machine were towed into Lagos under British control, and an organization not yet 2 years old had shown that it could plan an operation of genuine strategic sensitivity and see it through without a single shot being fired in anger. That, in the end, was always the point. Not the ships, valuable as they were. The proof that it could be done at all, and that a country fighting for its survival had found, in a converted fishing trawler and 32 men willing to break the rules, one more way to keep fighting.